Allo is a protocol for doing capital allocation, and it will let you do QF. We have groups like Endowment that have been able to incorporate QF into their existing platform. And so now when you donate to a nonprofit on Endowment, you're also participating in a quadratic funding round, just naturally, right? We're able to do stuff like that with Allo. The other cool thing about Allo is you can do stuff that's not even remotely related to QF. You can do direct grants, you can do crowdfunding, you can do anything that you can possibly think of. We have a lot of ideas that we've thought of, but we're hoping that developers will think of lots more and build tools for things like that.
On this episode, we talk with Kevin Owocki and Zakk from Gitcoin. Kevin, this was a double Kevin episode. I'm curious what stood out to you.
Yeah, this was great. I had a ton of fun. We talked a little bit about the inner workings of Allo. We talked about the different allocation strategies, pool managers. We talked about the registry. We dove into sort of like the high level vision for the broader Gitcoin space and where things might go in the future. So definitely one to check out. I really enjoyed it. What about you, Chase?
Yeah, I think it was really fun to get both Kevin and Zakk's take on when code becomes governable or when it should be governable and all of that stuff. We also had some spicy TypeScript takes at the end. So yeah, this was all around a really fun episode, and I hope you enjoyed as much as we enjoyed recording it. We are here with Kevin Owocki and Zakk from Gitcoin. Very excited to have you both on the pod.
Thanks for having us.
GM, y'all.
I'm very excited to talk about Gitcoin and Allo and some of the things coming out of Gitcoin. Maybe to start, for people who don't have context, we can get a little bit of background on each of you and what you're doing at Gitcoin. And maybe we'll start with Kevin and then go to Zakk.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Chase. So I'm Kevin Owocki. I co-founded Gitcoin back in 2017. Gitcoin's gone through a lot of iterations over the years as we've tried to figure out how to reach our mission of helping communities fund what matters. The most recent instantiation of Gitcoin is that we're now a decentralized modular suite of protocols and a DAO of contributors that support those protocols. So taking Gitcoin grants and turning it from a centralized monolithic product into a suite of money Legos that other people can use to fund what matters. So it's been a lot of evolution over the years. Gitcoin so far has delivered about $60 million worth of impact to Web3 communities, primarily open source, but also causes like climate, humanitarian relief in Ukraine, a COVID round. We've done some decentralized science. We've done lots of different good causes, but our ethos has traditionally been supporting open source software. So that's my background with the project, and maybe I'll hand it over to Zakk.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. My name is Zakk. I lead the engineering side for the Allo protocol. And just like Owocki said, a lot of stuff has been happening at Gitcoin. And I think from the outside, it's been pretty confusing to follow. And you might wonder why it is that Gitcoin is actually building a protocol. And that would be a very fair question. About 18 months ago, everybody at Gitcoin sat down and thought about how can we get more people running rounds? And there's a couple of important parts to that. The first of which is more people, meaning other people, not Gitcoin, just running rounds. Gitcoin runs rounds. Gitcoin is going to continue to run the grants program that we know and love. That will continue to happen quarterly. We'll continue to distribute at least $1 million every quarter. That's not going anywhere. But how can we get other people to run those rounds? And how can we run more rounds? So not just those 4 per year, but potentially lots and lots more per year. And then not only can we have more rounds running, how can we have more things happening that are distributing capital into ecosystems beyond just QF. QF is this amazing mechanism that we know and love, and it's very tried and true within Gitcoin, but it has its weaknesses, it has its limitations, and there's lots of other ways that communities want to and can distribute capital. So if you take those 3 questions, how can we run more rounds? How can we have other people running rounds? And how can we run rounds that are beyond QF rounds? Everything that has happened in Gitcoin the last year to 18 months starts to make sense. Gitcoin grants program continues. We're still running rounds there, right? The grant stack. Why did we shut down C grants and migrate to the grant stack? It's well, we couldn't have other people running rounds on the grant stack. And so we rolled out C grants and rolled down C grants and rolled out the grant stack. Now anybody can go and click a couple buttons and run a round, right? So that explains the grant stack and solves sort of the first 2 questions. There's this third question though of like, how can we run rounds that are not just QF? And that's where Allo comes in. Allo is a protocol for doing capital allocation, and it will let you do QF. We have groups like Endowment that have been able to incorporate QF into their existing platform. And so now when you donate to a nonprofit on Endowment, you're also participating in a quadratic funding round, just naturally, right? We're able to do stuff like that with Allo. The other cool thing about Allo is you can do stuff that's not even remotely related to QF. You can do direct grants, you can do crowdfunding, you can do, I don't know, anything that you can possibly think of. We have a lot of ideas that we've thought of, but we're hoping that developers will think of lots more and build tools for things like that. So that's sort of the genesis behind Allo and kind of everything that's happened at Gitcoin to get us to where we are today.
Yeah, I feel like that's very good context. And I think, there's so many different rabbit holes to go down within the Gitcoin ecosystem. The lore is sort of infinite, which is always exciting. I think it would be interesting to dive into some of how Allo actually works under the hood. I feel like there's some really interesting components going on, and it's been built in a way that feels very like modular in a way in terms of allocation strategies and all of that. So maybe you can give a high level overview of the different components that make Allo what it is.
Yeah, I would love to. Let's call it 3 key pieces to Allo. The first is Allo, what we call the pool manager. And this is sort of the central hub of Allo. Anytime you're distributing a pool of capital, you're going to create that pool inside of Allo. Whenever you're creating a pool of capital, you assign it an allocation strategy, which is the second part to Allo. An allocation strategy controls who's eligible to receive funding from that pool, who's eligible to allocate it, and how funds are distributed. And with those 3 things, you can write any allocation strategy to do just about anything. You can have a small direct grants program, you can have a large QF program, you could run a DAO-wide or a community-wide RFP program, you name it. But that's the second part. The third part is what we call the project registry, which is a profile or registry of profiles for anybody distributing capital or receiving capital, right? And so this is where we get to do a lot of fun things like project reputation. How do we know whether or not a public goods project is working in sustainability or the environment, right? It's like, well, they create a profile in the project registry. They use that anytime they're applying for capital anywhere across the Allo ecosystem on any tool that's built on Allo. So you get sort of the same portability of a project account that you do with a wallet account, if that makes sense. That's also where you get to track all the funding that a project has received or distributed, and lots of other things.
I appreciate you breaking it down to those 3 components. I just wanted to take a second and acknowledge that this was probably a lot of work, right? And it made sense for Gitcoin to start out with the minimum viable product, not a protocol, more of a centralized instance of what you're describing, and then eventually develop out this like factory pattern where now anyone else can run their own instance of like a Gitcoin. So before we dive even deeper into those 3 individual pieces, are there learnings that you took in that transition from the snapshot instance to the factory pattern?
Yeah. So maybe let's call it V0 of Allo is actually just a set of smart contracts for distributing funding through C grants. And this is pretty simple smart contracts. That was very much like early stage, trying to just see if this works, if people are going to participate in QF rounds, right? Those contracts were pretty minimal because they could be. The goal was just to distribute the matching pool in a QF round. And Owocki, I think, maybe wrote those or participated in the writing of those, so he can tell us more about that. You could fork those, but you couldn't interact with them to run your own quadratic funding round other than doing it through C grants, which led to Allo V1, which came out late last year. Allo V1 used a factory pattern. It used 2 strategies instead of just 1, and it let you run QF, right? You could run QF rounds, and there were some other mechanisms that you could use, but it was sort of just an improvement on V0 in the sense that we were testing the idea that other people would run other rounds or work with other mechanisms. It was still fairly limited intentionally, right? V3, and I'm not trying to correct you here, it actually uses the singleton pattern and not a factory pattern.
Nice.
For people who aren't familiar, what's the difference? Let's get into some nuance here.
I like
Yeah. And this is an interesting piece of like, I think, someone who like geeks out about protocol design and Solidity stuff. It's like, I think we were designing Allo late spring and into the summer, over the course of the summer. kind of arrived at the conclusion that we should use the singleton pattern. And then the Uniswap v4 paper came out and it was using the same singleton pattern. It was like, oh, that's kind of cool. I wonder, or I don't know, I'm not trying to compare us to the team at Uniswap, of course, but I wonder if we're going to see a lot of people starting to use the singleton pattern. That might be a good thing. That might not be. The factory pattern has a lot of really great benefits, mostly around exposure, like risk exposure, which hopefully people don't throw away. Factory pattern, for anybody who's not familiar, is both design patterns. There's a book that's actually on my bookcase behind me called The Gang of Four. It's right there. That talks about both of these and many other design patterns. Factory pattern, you have an object that generates other objects, a factory for objects. And so you create instances of whatever. In Uniswap v2's case, that was liquidity pools. They're each separate contracts or separate objects or whatever, and they exist on their own. This is where you get the risk mitigation, because they're all isolated from each other. In the singleton pattern, all of this exists inside of a single contract. And so you're still creating these, they're just existing inside of the single contract, which is what we're doing. So all the pools live inside of allo.sol. Sort of management of them is delegated to a separate contract, but the pools themselves live inside of allo.sol. And that's kind of the key difference there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious, what are the key benefits of doing that type of pattern over a factory pattern?
It's a great question. We're kind of like testing, in a way, what some of these benefits are, but there's really two that I see. The first is that it's a lot more gas efficient. You're not deploying a new contract every time you're trying to create whatever your object is inside of the singleton pattern. And so you end up using a lot less gas. The second is this like risk exposure security thing, in a way, kind of cuts both ways. And this is one of the things I think we'll kind of see. With the factory pattern, you've got all of these independent contracts that you're creating, which is good in the sense that they're all isolated from each other. So if one gets hacked, you're not hacking all of the liquidity of Uniswap. But the other side of that is that if there is a risk or if there is a known vulnerability, you have to go and upgrade all of these contracts separately, which is a huge coordination issue, a huge risk. It costs a ton of gas versus just updating a single contract. And so I'll throw out a third one. I think that like really when we were thinking about it, the singleton pattern is just simpler. It was like a simpler way of thinking about it. And so I, in general, with engineering decisions, always push for simplicity, but especially when we're talking about immutable smart contracts on chain, holding people's money. And so that's maybe like a third one that I'd throw out there.
Yeah, I threw it into ChatGPT, and I think pretty much everything you said is what was suggested. It was a single point of access, resource conservation, consistency, global configuration, and easier access and management. So a lot of that is kind of summarized by simplicity.
Nice.
In a way, it kind of reminds me of the argument for having precompiles enshrined into Ethereum, which is just like less to worry about, and everyone's referencing the same thing rather than having to create your own version of every damn thing.
Yeah, that's like a great connection to make. Yeah.
From a design perspective, I'd be curious, are there things that were kind of like mental model shifts in building in this way versus building more of like a factory type of system?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we wanted when we were going through the design here is like we wanted the implementation of allocation strategies to be really simple, right? Like, could you create an allocation strategy in an hour with 100 lines of solidity as someone who knows solidity? When we wanted to do that without sacrificing like your optionality or the design space, right? I guess this is maybe less to do with the singleton pattern specifically and more just like how we were thinking about the interface for it. But we spent months going back and forth on different implementations for this. At one point, we had 5 contracts that you're going to have to like write and deploy separately, 5 strategy contracts. And then we brought that down to 1. Allo v1 had 2 that you had to write and deploy. I think 1 is the right solution. But we're able to accomplish that goal. Like there's really 3 methods that you have to implement. And so we're kind of like your total contract can be within 100 lines of solidity for a fairly simple mechanism. They can be much longer. I think our average is probably like 250 to 350 lines of solidity, which is still like low. That's not a lot, which is awesome. And you can write them fairly quickly. We've had teams like Sablier turned around 2 strategies in 3 days, which is awesome. So that was the main thing that we're focused on in the design here.
As Gitcoin starts to develop these sort of protocols that are more modular and can be used in all these different ways. I'm curious where this like open contribution feels like it fits into this and how you think that expands Gitcoin's surface area for what's possible.
Yeah, totally. Gitcoin's been going through what I call 3 transitions. So it's gone from a centralized product to decentralized and modular protocols. It's gone from just quadratic funding into many mechanisms. Zakk mentioned quadratic funding, quadratic voting, RFPs. Eventually, it'll support retroactive public goods funding, optimism style. And then it's gone from being for Ethereum and for Vitalik and the Ethereum Foundation to any EVM-based community. And there are dozens of DAOs that have billions of dollars of treasury that could be allocating to community people who are doing great stuff in their community. So just to take those each step by step, the centralized product to decentralized modular protocols, we needed decentralization because decentralization is really good at creating credible neutrality. So basically you don't have to worry that, Kevin Owocki is going to turn evil one day and change the platform business model or something. Probably more of a risk that like whoever replaced me as CEO in the company was going to do that. But still, because it's a protocol, you've now got credible neutrality. You've got better decision making in a democratic environment, which is what protocols are really good at. And modularity allows you to sub out different Lego pieces. So in Gitcoin 1.0, we had this thing called pairwise quadratic funding. And there was no way to substitute that out because it was just this giant monolithic pile of spaghetti code that I sort of wrote when I was rapid experimenting of like the design space of what's possible in Gitcoin. And now that we've got these well-documented decentralized modular money Legos, you can sort of compose them in different ways. So you've got the registry, which is the registry of projects. You've got the allocation strategies. And then you've got identity mechanisms like Gitcoin Passport, which is meant to provide Sybil resistance to the ecosystem. We can go down a whole rabbit hole about Sybil resistance if we wanted to. But so centralized product to decentralized modular protocols enables the surface area for innovation to just increase a lot because now people can substitute in and out different Legos for allocation strategies or identity. And in the heels of that, we wanted to move from quadratic funding to many different mechanisms. The market has changed since 2019. Now people are really excited about self-curated registries like Protocol Guild. People are really excited about retroactive public goods funding because of optimism. Prop House in the Nouns ecosystem is really hot right now, like kind of like a reverse grant mechanism. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to cover the entire design space of what's possible in capital allocation mechanisms. QF is just the first app. It's like when you're a kid and you got a new Windows PC and you had like Minesweeper and Solitaire preloaded onto it, but really any app could be on it. That's kind of what we're doing with Allo V2 is many different capital allocation mechanisms. Another analogy I like to use is that Gitcoin 1.0 was like a screwdriver and Gitcoin 2.0 is like a Swiss Army knife. And I think a Swiss Army knife for capital allocation is what we need in order to allocate more capital to more interesting things that matter in these communities. And so the third transition is being just for Ethereum and the Ethereum Foundation to being for any EVM-based community. Any DAO or NFT project or alt layer 1 or layer 2 can now use Gitcoin grants in their ecosystem without having to ask anyone. So those are the 3 transitions with Gitcoin 2.0, centralized to decentralized and modular, just QF to many mechanisms, and then Ethereum to any EVM-based community. And we think that this sets us up in a foundationally more strategic way to fund what matters in the Web3 ecosystem, to have Gitcoin be decentralized, modular, and have many mechanisms on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this interesting dynamic when I'm thinking about Gitcoin, and I think the way other protocols have evolved as well, which is kind of going from, very opinionated to much more modular and flexible in a lot of ways. And I don't know, I think there are probably a few reasons that that's the case, but I'm curious, as you're both thinking about building out these more modular components within Gitcoin for people to be able to leverage, how are you thinking about, how opinionated the architecture of these things should be versus like how open they need to be for other people to contribute and sort of put these Legos together? And I guess that's a question for both of you.
To me, one of the big trade-offs I always see in software is configuration versus convention. So convention is just like, I don't want to have to think about it. Let me just use it out of the box. This is what Apple products are really good at. Whereas configuration is my Linux box where I can basically overwrite any tool or configure any tool in the ecosystem to do anything I want. And I think striking a balance between creating a product for people who don't want to tune any of the parameters versus for the hackers that really want to be able to configure everything are just like 2 different apertures of what you can build software for. And I kind of think of like Allo protocol as being very configurable for the developers, and Gitcoin Grant Stack is more like out of the box. I just want to use what Gitcoin uses. Zakk, I'll pass it over to you though, since you're closer to it. I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it, right? If what you want is to just run a QF round, or now in the near future run a direct grants round, you can just use Grant Stack, and you don't have to think about the allocation mechanism. You don't have to think about kind of any of that stuff. Grant Stack, all that stuff is embodied in Grant Stack, and so you can just use the product and get really far. If you're a developer, especially, or if you're just somebody who's thinking about public goods funding and you want to try other mechanisms, what Allo provides is a like tool set or a playground that, on the one hand, gives you baked in all of Gitcoin's 5 years of experience operating in this space, and two, the flexibility to explore the space on your own. And so one great example that I'll throw out there is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is something we haven't really seen take off recently in public goods funding, and there's reasons for that, right? I think there's like a lot of scar tissue still from the ICO craze, and probably will be for plenty of time. But like Kickstarter and GoFundMe, these are like very successful platforms for getting things funded. And so those things will be easier to do on crypto rails for all the same reasons that all of the basic like financial infrastructure is easier to do on crypto rails. Gitcoin's not going to explore that space. That's just like not, or I should say like the Grant Stack is probably not going to explore that space, because it's not the core competence of the Grant Stack. That's not part of the Grant Stack's mission, but it is a very like potentially very fruitful, certainly very interesting space to go and explore. If you were in the absence of Allo, right, you're starting from scratch. That's like a lot of solidity you're probably going to have to write. In the world where we have Allo, where you have Allo as an engineer, if you just want to play around with the idea of building a crowdfunding platform and kind of F around and see how it goes. Is that the right quote? F around and see?
It's
anyway.
fuck around and find out.
But
Kevin and I are like the meme.
I didn't know if we could swear. Yeah. I didn't know if we could swear on this. Okay, cool. All right, cool. Yeah. So fuck around and find out. A crowdfunding allocation strategy would probably be 200 to 300 lines of solidity. Like you could write that in a day or two and then slap together a front end and post on Twitter, and I don't know, I'll create a crowdfund. So you have this wide range, I guess, in some.
Do you see a future iteration of your, I believe it was your step 3, where it was Ethereum specific to EVM to broader internet / global funding? Do you see that as a potential evolution of Allo itself, or do you see it more so as the next potential generalized crowdfunding tool might build using Allo underneath? Like just making it accessible to any EVM is enough to then enable like this to go outside of the crypto ecosystem.
I mean, the EVM has incredible network effects. Even networks that are not Ethereum use the Ethereum virtual machine, right? And so the nice thing about this is that almost all blockchain-based networks have EVM support, or they have EVM support on their roadmap. And so I kind of think of choosing to build on the EVM is just riding a wave. I think most blockchains are going to be EVM compatible. And if we believe, actually it's riding a wave on top of a wave, right? Because we're betting that blockchain is going to replace all these old mainframes that are in these banks everywhere. And then on top of blockchains, we're betting on the EVM, right? And so we're riding a wave on a wave of what does the future of finance look like. And I think our bet here is that people are going to need to allocate capital in the future. And so if our bet is right, if blockchains replace mainframes and EVM is the primary virtual machine, then in 10 or 15 years, then Allo protocol can be a Swiss Army knife for allocating capital for any of the world's public goods. And there's plenty of things out there that are worthy of allocating capital to that are not in the crypto ecosystem. And so I think that we're betting pretty hard on the EVM because of that, but also because there's plenty of DAOs that have billion-dollar treasuries or multi-million-dollar treasuries that need to allocate capital to their ecosystems. And running a centralized grants program doesn't scale. It also creates a power insiders game where if you're on the grants committee, you have a lot of power and not a lot of visibility of what's going on the ground. Hiring people doesn't scale because then you create a hierarchical organization. And so we're big believers that Allo protocol is going to help fund public goods and allocate capital to what matters in these DAO ecosystems in a new network-based way. And we're going to start with EVM-based communities, things that look like NFT projects and DeFi and L2, please reach out to us. Go to allo.gitcoin.co and check it out if you'd like to get Allo into your community. And we're going to start there, but then we're going to reach escape velocity and fund the world's public goods from there, but only once we have momentum on EVM-based stuff.
So I know that there are Allo improvement proposals. I know that that's sort of part of this whole community contribution thing. It seems like that's separate from allocation strategies and people building their own allocation strategies. I guess A, let's make sure that that's true. But B, I'm curious, like, what the thinking there is and what the sort of structure there provides you versus sort of being an open source project where it's just like, contribute whatever you want and we'll maybe merge your changes versus a more structured sort of having an AIP and doing that whole process.
Yeah, there's like two ways that you can contribute here. One of which is writing your own allocation strategy, and there's no barriers there. If you want to write your own allocation strategy and run a pool with it, there's, it's a protocol, it's permissionless. There's nothing anybody can do to get in your way, for better or for worse. There's more that we could kind of say there around, we have a list of allowed strategies or approved strategies that we're exploring, but for the most part, you can create your own custom strategy and you can be off to the races. If you were to submit a pull request to the Allo v2 repository to update the protocol, probably wouldn't merge it. We have this AIP process for that. And the idea is that we want to design and make improvements to the protocol. We want to be responding to how people are using it. And if there's something we can do to make the protocol, to change the protocol to make it easier to do, we want to do that. But we want to make these changes slowly and thoughtfully and carefully, especially as the number of people running pools on Allo increases over time. So we don't want to brick it. We don't want to introduce a security vulnerability or anything like that. The AIP process is a fork of the EIP process, which is a fork of the PEP process. Right? Anybody who's been a software engineer for a couple of years kind of knows these processes. So you're probably already up to speed on what the phases are and how to write a proposal and all of that. But it's a way for us to, as a community, make decisions that have been well reasoned, right? Using sort of disciplined engineering thinking and using that to make updates and changes to the protocol. So that's the AIP process in a nutshell, but that's also kind of the difference between these two things.
And who is likely the person that's introducing that AIP? Is it usually an engineer? Is it a user of the protocol that might not be technical? Is it?
It could be anybody. You'd have to be somewhat technical because it's about governing kind of like the code that makes up the core protocol. That doesn't necessarily mean being a software engineer. If you were to be looking through the code, either because you're writing an allocation strategy or just curious about building on Allo, and you see something at the protocol level that we can change has a tangible improvement, tangible benefit to the protocol, that's where you'd write an AIP. And there's a separate repository with all the existing AIPs. All the ones that are there right now are pertaining to Allo v1, but there's a couple of changes there that our team wrote, some that some external teams wrote and contributed and governed, ended up like resulting in changes to Allo v1. When Allo v2 goes live, any future changes from there will be done through the AIP process. So
there's an interesting point in a life cycle of a project where it gets to the point where you do want to have improvement proposals, basically.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you guys have a take on when code becomes governable.
That's a great question.
Versus just kind of the spaghetti that Kevin was mentioning, which I'm sure is underselling his skills, but certainly feels different.
Yeah.
Well, you should take a look at that code base. Yeah. There's a difference between my code that I wrote was to we didn't know what Gitcoin was going to be. And so it was just like about rapidly exploring the design space. Whereas now we've done $60 million worth of funding of public goods. Like there's something there. And that's the point at which you need to start governing the code from there because there's actually value on top. Just the fact that it's a modular architecture, I think is a breakthrough in how you would govern that because you don't have to replace all of Gitcoin grants at once. You can just sub out a specific module from it. And in that sense, you're already sort of enabling a little bit of governance on it because people can choose which components they want to use to build things. So that's a step forward in governance. The fact that it's decentralized modular protocol is a step forward in governance. But, I don't have a strong opinion from there about AIPs and how people are going to want to govern it from there. I think the answer is, and Zakk, kick me under the table if I'm saying this wrong, but like we don't really know yet because Allo v2 is just getting through audits right now. I think have us back in a year or so and we'll know how Allo v2 governance has gotten. But just the fact that we're on the starting line with a decentralized modular protocol, I think we've solved 80% of the problems that Gitcoin 1.0 would have from there.
I agree with that. There's an interesting take here about like what is governed. And there's this point around like the pool that you create uses the allocation strategy that you select when you create that pool. And you have full control over what that allocation strategy is and what that allocation strategy does. You can use one of the sort of pre-baked ones that we've written, like our QF strategy. And so if you just want to build a front end that does Gitcoin style QF, you can use our strategies to create pools. But you can also create your own completely own custom strategy if that's what you want. And so that part is like you have sovereignty there, right? There's no imposition from governance on you there. Changes to the protocol is like at the beginning that'll be controlled by a multi-sig. I actually have a post in the governance forum that kind of outlines the roadmap here. In the beginning, that'll be owned by a multi-sig that is owned and managed by the Allo team. But over time, that'll eventually just be governed by the community of Gitcoin token holders. So anybody who holds GTC will be able to vote on that. We'll go through the AIP process for, let's say there's like we want to change something about the protocol. That'll go through the AIP process. We'll create that change, merge it. That's not what's on chain. So we then deploy it. And then governance has to vote to approve to make those changes. We still have a lot. That's like a very high level of how I imagine this going. There's still a ton of details to figure out there. Like governance is really hard for anything. And I would say like governing binary decisions that you can describe on chain is like probably as easy as it gets, but that's still really fucking hard.
Especially when it's highly technical. I mean, and you don't know, if GTC holders have enough technical prowess to understand the specific nuances of protocol upgrades.
Yeah, we've seen, a lot of communities are doing this. And so we're going to talk to a lot of people within the Gitcoin community and outside the Gitcoin community. We're going to figure out the best process here. But there are just still a ton of unknown unknowns.
To the point of GTC token holders not really being in a position to govern the protocol, I think that as Gitcoin moves from Gitcoin to kind of like a more decentralized ecosystem where we have credibly neutral protocols and we have programs built on top. Programs are just names for people who are running opinionated rounds. We've got a climate program in the ecosystem. There's an Arbitrum DAO grants program. There's grants programs at a bunch of different projects, and those are all very opinionated. But the program that Gitcoin runs is the Ethereum open source program, and that's kind of like where Gitcoin came from. It bootstrapped its own program to dog food the protocol, but also because our mission is to fund what matters. And I kind of think of the GTC holders as better equipped to govern that program. And that's one of the primary use cases of the GTC token that we at least envisioned from the start. Not like king making which protocol is the best one in a global sense, but really saying, for this pilot program that we're running, this is the best mechanism for us to run. And there's just a slightly nuanced take that you have to have on the Gitcoin ecosystem to be able to see what GTC is useful for and what it's not. So I hope that I've painted a higher resolution picture of Gitcoin and the listener can now envision an ecosystem with many different modular parts as opposed to just GTC holders govern one Gitcoin protocol.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about that modularity. The Money Legos meme, I think, was pretty successful, especially in DeFi, and illustrating how you can have these entirely different components that work together to build more complicated structures that eventually can kind of snowball and create their own offshoots. Now, there's the modularity that we've talked a little bit about where you can choose your different allocation strategy, but you also have other products like Gitcoin Passport that a team might decide to use as their Sybil resistance tool that adds another sort of layer of where the modularity is interfacing with other products. How do you think about, outside of just allowing for different allocation strategies, what are these other sorts of places where you're enabling people to build almost Money Lego style pieces of your tech stack? Yeah, we have had a lot of really long conversations about this internally, and we often end up, I think we haven't quite figured out the best way to communicate this, but Allo, in addition to being very modular, is very flexible. And so there's a lot of opportunity for exactly this, right? We think about an allocation strategy. I said earlier, there's three parts to it, right? So who's eligible to receive from the fund, who's eligible to allocate, and then how are funds distributed.
Allo V2 is already launched or isn't even launched yet. And both Sablier and Hedgie have contributed allocation strategies where the distribution is using their platform, right? And so regardless of what allocation mechanism you're using, whether that's QF or direct grants or something else entirely, right? You could distribute it using Hedgie's token grant product or Sablier's streaming product, right? And they wrote strategies for those. There's actually 2 Sablier ones. And so you have that layer of this sort of like composability question, which is how we're actually distributing funds once they're allocated. The eligibility piece, there's a ton more to say there, right? Like hypercerts, I think is really interesting. When you make an allocation, it mints a hypercert, and then you have all the exciting things that are happening with hypercerts. The eligibility piece is another one. You can use attestations here, right? And so you're looking for someone to hold a particular attestation in order to be able to allocate or in order to be able to donate or whatever it is, or to be eligible to apply. That's totally fair game. You could use token balances here. There's like a ton of room for creativity there just around how you do programmatic eligibility, right? Gitcoin, you apply, a person actually reviews your application and then pays gas to either accept or reject you into the round. And I think for a lot of grants programs, it's going to continue to be the case. They want that sort of human review, but you could do something that's like badge based, like what Optimism is experimenting with, and you could make it be programmatic. So if a wallet holds a badge, then they can allocate, right? Or if people are familiar with HAT's protocol, right? It's like if your wallet holds a hat, then you can allocate capital from a pool using like a direct grants program or something. Another sort of integration layer there. Passport, bringing back to your question specifically about Passport, you have the ability now to mint your Passport on chain as an EAS attestation. And so you can take your Passport score and you can push it on chain, and then a smart contract can look at that Passport score and for it to be above a certain threshold in the same way that you would otherwise do with our API products, right? And so you could use that in eligibility too. In order to apply to be a recipient from a pool that's allocated using Allo, you have to have a Passport score that's above a certain threshold. And you could do all that programmatically. You wouldn't have to have a human in the process there, which is really cool.
I think the modularity there and really being able to plug in, I shouldn't even say modularity, more like composability there is really exciting. And it feels like that's something that Gitcoin has always kind of been moving towards. And so being able to see all of these different components and pieces come together is exciting at a protocol level. As we start to wrap up this conversation, I'm very curious, as you've been diving into the more open sort of building Gitcoin's own open protocol side of things, are there certain like tools or libraries or frameworks that you've been playing with or that you think are underrated in this ecosystem or maybe beyond? For both of you, I'd be curious.
Well, Metal is pretty great. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's...
This is a paid show.
I don't know if that's... Yeah. Was that an alley-oop? Did I make the dunk?
No one has answered Metropolis, so I appreciate it.
I don't know what to say there. Metal is great. I'm a huge fan of Forge and Foundry. I think that's just made writing smart contracts so much more fun. I think I started first playing around with that sometime maybe the end of last summer, and I forget exactly when it came out, but it's just been a total game changer. That's just like such a huge quality of life improvement to be using Forge and Foundry. No knock on hard hat. I'm also just like, it's hard to buy into hard hat. I'm also just like not that bought into TypeScript, which I'm sure was going to get me a lot of heat on Twitter.
That is a spicy take. But, we had the WAGME guys on a few episodes ago, and that was a big TypeScript bull episode.
It was.
That's great. TypeScript is a psyop from Microsoft to steal development mindshare away from React, and no one can convince me otherwise. Jesus. TypeScript is the biggest waste of fucking time that's happened in
it's totally
web
getting cut
development.
for the episode preview on Twitter.
Yeah,
This is clickbait.
You can keep it. You can say whatever you want. No one will ever convince me to use TypeScript.
Kevin, can you go spicier?
Oh boy.
If Zack's going to go hot, then I think I'm going to go cool. And I'm just going to say, because this is Gitcoin's roots, open source software, I just have a ton of appreciation for all of the open source components that we just take for granted. Open Zeppelin, ERC20s, Gnosis, Saves, Allo Protocol, Gitcoin Passport. These things have a very short window where they go from something new and cool that creates a new paradigm to when they're just like part of the fabric of our development experience. And by the way, I'm only talking about the tip of the iceberg because I talked about Solidity libraries, right? Like Open Zeppelin and Passport and Allo and Safe and all of these things. Like, think about the stack of just like operating systems and networking equipment and TCP/IP. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants with open source software. So I think it's incredible what you can pull out of a box and build in a hackathon because of the mountain of money, Legos, and open source software that we have. And I just have a ton of appreciation for all of that.
Totally. Yeah, that's a good answer. I think both of your answers
That was a good
were
answer.
I like that. Yeah, we have the hot and the cold.
I feel like we've reached a milestone in the decentralization of Gitcoin, that we've decentralized my spicy takes, and now Zakk is giving them and I'm giving the cool takes. So it's a milestone for sure.
I will take it. I think my TypeScript take is my spiciest take, period.
It's about to become your most famous take too. Sorry to all the TypeScript developers out there.
We'll see. Bring it, man. PHP is great. I don't know if you've heard.
I've really been struggling. This is not something you asked at all, but I'm going to go on a little tangent. I'm a Python developer. I love Python. I love just the syntax of it, and it's just such a beautiful language. And it's been hard for me in the transition from Gitcoin 1.0 to 2.0 to have to do a lot of things in JavaScript, just because I don't think like JavaScript does. And every JavaScript code I write is a spaghetti of callbacks, doing callbacks. And I know there's better ways to write JavaScript these days, but I haven't found an IDE that I feel at home with yet. So tips on where to jump in on the JavaScript ecosystem is something I would welcome if people want to tweet them at me.
You should check out jQuery. It's a pretty cool framework.
Man, I miss those days sometimes.
Same.
Sometimes
Simpler
I miss
times.
those days.
They were simpler times, yeah.
So simple. Yeah.
And that's like the opposite of we're so early.
Just think, like 20 years of web development, we didn't need types. Amazing.
Zakk was furious.
TypeScript bear to the max. Well, this was such a wonderful conversation. Where can people learn more about the both of you, about Allo, and about Gitcoin?
I think Twitter is a great place to start. I'm 0x Zakk, ZAKK, pretty much everywhere. Twitter and GitHub. And yeah, that's probably the best place to learn more about me. If you want to try and convince me that I should give TypeScript a try, Twitter is the place to go.
Yeah.
Harass Zakk on Twitter. Yeah.
To Twitter.
Bring it on.
So allo.gitcoin.co is where you can check out Allo Protocol v2, which is just going through audits, and you can read the documentation at docs.allo.gitcoin.co. I am available at twitter.com/Owocki, and I'm really excited to explore the design space of coordination mechanisms in Web3. I think the future of capital allocation is massively multiplayer, and can't wait to build that world. And hopefully we'll take that impact.gitcoin.co number from 50 or 60 million up to 500 million over the next couple of years. So it's all a means to an end to our mission, which is to fund what matters. And yeah, reach out to me on Twitter, twitter.com/Owocki if you're interested in chatting.
Love it.
Beautiful.
Thanks for chatting with us.
Thanks,
Appreciate
y'all.
it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having
Thanks for
us.
coming
This
on.
was really a great conversation. Thank you.
It was fun.